This may be the only time any of you get to see me on the left. Did you plan this, Peter?
Yes.
I thought you'd enjoy being there for a change.
Reminds me of the evening I had dinner at the AFL-CIO. In any case, I guess my views are very different than the previous speaker. It's an accounting identity that the trade deficit equals the savings deficit. And one can say, well, we have a trade deficit because we have a savings deficit, and run causality from trade deficit to savings deficit, or I could run causality in the other direction. And if I wanted to debunk the Trump administration, that's what I would do. You know, I was an economist feeling in a fortress position, as many economists do right now, wondering how is it that Brexit happened or Trump happened. And by the way, I never endorsed Donald Trump. I want to be clear about that, and I'm not here to defend his policies. I could structure an argument that would make that work, and you've just heard it. If I was worried about the economics profession being debunked as it was before Keynes wrote during the Depression, I'd certainly make that argument. But to focus on my argument, it's also, by the way, true that the current account deficit, which is the trade deficit, has to equal net capital inflows. And I could say because we have a current account deficit, therefore we have capital inflows, or I could do the reverse and build an argument in either direction and use perfectly reasonable sounding economics to accomplish that. In my mind, the trade deficit is the result of a combination of the technological forces driving globalization on the one hand, and mercantilism and nationalism on the other. We have a rules-based international trading system which I much admire and feel is sorely threatened. International trade law, and I've written about this, and I read books other than those published at my university, is remarkable in that it is the most economically informed aspect of law along with antitrust. It's as almost as if the economists with the serapins sitting at the feet of the gods, being the lawyers that write these documents. And it's conceived from the notion that it brings together groups of market economies for the purposes of trading on the basis of comparative advantage. And things like exchange rates will adjust to ensure that the outcomes that we teach on blackboards at our universities when we teach Hector-Oline and comparative advantage will indeed happen. That trade will be balanced, that employment will be full, that most importantly, that adjustment takes place. That when we remove trade barriers, workers effectively move from one kind of employment to another, with maybe with some disruption and requiring some assistance, but they're not permanently displaced from the labor force. In reality, we have to recognize a couple of things. One is that most of our trade deficit was with China, 60%. Of the balance, Germany is important and Japan has been important and continues to be. And if you solve the trade deficit with China, you probably have solved the problem. But to move away from that for a moment, if you have a system that's based on the notion that markets will prevail and that trade will balance out, then when you have 3 of the 4 largest economies, which constitute more than half of trade, operating on the basis that it is a matter of public policy that we should run a trade surplus, that exchange rates in some cases should be manipulated to that effect, and there are a variety of ways other than currency market intervention to cause, by virtue of public policy, to cause an exchange rate to be undervalued, then the system can't work. So we have to look at trade policy, among other things, to determine why we have a trade deficit. Not just our trade policy, but theirs. And it requires most fundamentally an open mind about these issues, because it causes us to think in ways that are contrary to what we put up on blackboards. I like to tell my colleagues that pure competition is where children learn about markets. It's a beginning, but it's not an end. The story is not in the assumptions we make about free trade, but in their violation in the real world and whether they have consequence. All of our models have violation in the real world. The question is, do the violations have consequence? Now, in our case, we've had a profound failure to adjust. We have had people who have left the labor force completely for no apparent reason other than they feel discouraged. We have 7 million men between the ages of 25 and 55 unemployed and not looking for work. Alongside that, part of our fiscal deficit finances a support program which can impose marginal tax rates, effective marginal tax rates of 50 to 70% for going to work. After all, with Obamacare in place, with the food stamps program modified as it has been, a healthy male, 25 years of age, sitting at home watching ESPN in 31 states is eligible for free health care and food stamps, and can therefore sponge off his girlfriend and never have to look for work. It's mindful of, some of the Northern European countries permitting kids to go to school forever and always getting a stipend to do it. Of course, that's gone now. So, we need to talk more than about aggregates. We need to talk about specific policies that have effect on behavior. So what I am saying is that the trade policies of principal trading partners have something to do with this deficit, and the way we spend our money, not just how much the government spends, has something to do with it too. That said, the consequences for the trade deficit are profound. The amount of debt that we are amassing is great. I think that looking at some magical number like 60% is silly, simply because we have the ability to print the world's money. We will probably pierce through 60%, but a meltdown on the basis of the U.S. debt will not happen the way it did in Greece, because Greece can't print money. Greece needs euros to pay its debts. Our debt is denominated in dollars. Our meltdown will come the day that not private actors don't want to hold our debt, but central banks don't want to hold it, because they hold a great deal of it. And when the American public doesn't want to hold it, that's when we'll have a problem. We will never have the Greek problem of not being able to come up with currency to pay for it. We can always print it. Rather, it's going to be an issue of when do people demand such high interest rates that it makes our federal budget, unsustainable. It throws us into some kind of black hole of a kind we have never seen. Because we've never seen the principal reserve currency country go bust. So we don't know what it looks like. This is so remindful of Mr. Summers saying, well, in every financial crisis we have a long period of adjustment. Every financial crisis, when was the last time we had a financial crisis like 2008? There is no observation set. One must have observations to draw generalizations about the past. I would suggest to you we have no counterintuitive. We have no other examples to draw attention to. We don't know what it's really going to look like. We just know probably that it will not be nice, that it will be protracted and take a long time to recover. Now, the immediate effect of people not working is to have a lower GDP. I find it absolutely absurd for anyone to argue that since technology has displaced workers in manufacturing, that we shouldn't expect, if we resolved our trade deficit, not to have more manufacturing jobs. And therefore, that begs the questions of what does it look like if to have more manufacturing jobs? Well, we know that in manufacturing and in import industries as well as export industries, that workers are more productive than they are in domestic pursuits where they, do not compete in trade. And this is an observation that bears out in other economies. So we would have more aggregate demand. Probably more of these people would stop watching ESPN and go to work. How many more would depend on how we in turn dealt with the social programs that are there to support them now? Right now, it takes a powerful incentive to get one of these guys off the couch. If those were removed, they might get off the couch more easily. But in any case, shifting employment to these sectors would raise GDP. It would probably raise R&D, because most of the manufacturing is, a good deal of the R&D is done by manufacturing type activities. Now, I would point out that a lot of R&D has followed American manufacturing abroad in response to trade barriers. For example, consider the situation in China, where a good way to get intellectual property protection and win cases in court is to promise to move more R&D activity over there, as just happened with Apple. And then to not enforce the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I don't know that something happened there, but I would be very eager if I was Mr. Trump's White House, if I could actually get the Justice Department to do what I wanted, to be at least investigating the emails on that. In any case, I doubt that they'd find anything because people have become very, very good at avoiding prosecution. If they know in advance they have to avoid prosecution. When you think about it, the people that get people like General Motors in trouble are not at the top. It's like Watergate. It's somebody going into business for themselves, and then they're getting passed up, and so on and so forth. Now, how do we get out of this mess? I mean, GDP we've been growing at 2% a year. To say it's due to productivity growth is to not ask the basic question. Why all of a sudden has productivity growth gotten so much smaller? Does it have something to do with the trade deficit? Well, I think it does have something to do with the contraction of manufacturing. I think it does. I mean, I find it ridiculous when I hear arguments from Northwestern, from Gordon, that say, well, all the good stuff's been invented. I guess he hasn't been reading about robotics. And then there's the great one. What would you rather have? This, or a flush toilet? Well, I'm old enough to have actually used an outhouse. I'd rather have this. I can use an outhouse to keep this, because this makes me so much more productive, and it provides me with so much more freedom of movement during the day. I don't have to be near a telephone all the time, and so on and so forth. And remember that Woody Allen movie where he paid a character who calls his office and tells him where he's going to be every 15 minutes and what number he's going to be at. And Diane Keaton said, you forgot to tell him about the pay phone booth. You'll be passing going down the street. That's what my life was like before this. Because I don't work at a large institution, I work at a mega institution, which means I work alone. I was always telling people where they could find me. But in terms of a solution, I think that we need a grand bargain on exchange rates. We had one before, the Plaza Accord, but this time a grand bargain on exchange rates would have to include China. And China is not going to play by the rules on this sort of thing, so I don't think a grand bargain is possible. That would help us get out of this mess. So it does come back to what Trump talked about during the campaign. But I would also point out that Romney talked about the very same things when he was campaigning, but didn't attract quite the same ridicule because, let's face it, Donald is kind of a hard guy to like. And he's not very politically correct. But there's something else going on. We're now at a moment in time where people say that universities are becoming closed spaces with closed minds, and that is indeed happening. But the economics profession is not even willing to cast doubt on what they've been prescribing for the last 50 years because of events like Brexit and Trump. They don't want to open their minds. But to me, that is the greatest barrier to finding a solution, because we're going to have to deal with China in very different ways than say, please sign this agreement and comply by these rules, because that simply won't happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.